But the first thing to say, which is really important, is that the new Cold War is not like the old Cold War. I grew up here in Oxford in the 60s and 70s and 80s during the old Cold War, and I remember it really clearly. I remember the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. I remember Vietnam. I remember campaigning for dissidents. I remember my mother writing letters late into the night from our kitchen table to Leonid Brezhnev, demanding the release of Russian and other dissidents from the Gulag. I remember all that really clearly, and what we face now is not the same as that. It's different in economic terms, because Russia, although a very big country, the biggest in the world by landmass, is not a particularly big economy, about the size of California, about the size of New York State, about the size of Italy, about the size of Spain. It all depends how you measure it. But this is not a conflict between two equally matched opponents on the economic side, and it's not a conflict between two equally matched opponents on the military side. Russia's military has improved substantially since the 1990s, but it's still tiny in terms of compared to the United States, let alone NATO. Russia can attack other countries so long as it can drive to them. It doesn't have the heavy lift capability to move large numbers of forces to the other side of the world. A lot of the most important elements of the Russian military are still awaiting modernization. So it's not a big, full-scale global military conflict. And it's not an ideological conflict in the way the Soviet Union was. I don't know, did anyone here in the room here study Marxism-Leninism?
Hands up.
Hands up. Okay, very good, yes. So some of you may remember dialectical materialism. Now, Christian, my friend over there at the back, and I are unusual in that we are Westerners who studied this stuff. I actually somewhere have a certificate showing that I did a course in dialectical materialism. Please don't ask me questions about it now. But dialectical materialism, Marxism-Leninism, they were serious philosophical constructs. You could fill a room this size with books on Tiamat and Marxism-Leninism. I don't think you could fill this room, or even one shelf on one wall of this room, with books about the political philosophy behind Vladimir Putin's regime. You could have the collected works of Mr. Dugin, you could have the collected works of Mr. Surkov, you could have maybe a few other speeches and lectures and so on, but this is not a serious ideological conflict between radically different philosophical approaches to the world and to humanity. And indeed, I would say the divisions within the West are much bigger than the divisions, the divisions within the West are much bigger than the divisions between the West and the Putin regime in Russia. Mr. Erdogan is the way he runs Turkey looks pretty similar to me to the way that Mr. Putin runs Russia. There's a big difference between Turkey, a very early member of NATO and close ally of the United States. There's a very big difference between Turkey and the rest of Europe, much less of a difference when you go across the Black Sea to Russia. So it's not a serious ideological conflict in the way that it was. So what is the new Cold War? Well, it's about history and it's about geography, first of all. And I think the fundamental point is a difference of opinion about what happened from 1989 to 1991. Now, at the time, it was very easy to believe that everybody from Washington, D.C., or from Vancouver to Vladivostok, everyone around the world basically thought the same thing, that the collapse of communism was good. Communism was a system which had failed economically, it failed politically, and it was coming to a well-deserved end, and everybody would be happy about the result. And that was a misleading sense of euphoria, because there was actually, as well as the collapse of communism, there was the collapse of a big geopolitical construct, which I would call an empire, which was the Soviet Empire. And views differ, to put it mildly, on the collapse of the Soviet Empire, of the Warsaw Pact. For many of the people who were not in it by choice, it was one of the happiest days of their lives. This was a moment of national liberation. It was for them as 1945 had been for countries like France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Greece, and others, when you were freed from foreign occupation. And there were many people in Russia who also felt that way, but there are many people who don't. I think this view is epitomized by Vladimir Putin saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe. In fact, he didn't just say it was a geopolitical catastrophe, he said it was the geopolitical catastrophe. And that makes plenty of sense for many people, particularly inside Russia, but it is utterly horrifying for people who live in what we used to call the captive nations, now the former captive nations. This is as shocking for them as it would be as if you had a German leader saying that the collapse of the Third Reich was a catastrophe. They just cannot understand how someone can advocate this viewpoint. And so we have a really sharp difference of opinion about this, and we have a sharp difference of opinion about the status of those countries of Central and Eastern Europe. From one point of view, they are seen as a kind of geopolitical trophy. This is what the Soviet Union got in return for defeating fascism and defeating Nazi Germany. These countries were liberated from fascism by the Red Army, an immense sacrifice. They should be grateful. They should be grateful for their liberation, and they should not be going off after other interpretations of history or trying to pursue other geopolitical orientations. If you're in those countries, it looks very different. You feel, if you were from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, many other countries, you feel you were caught between the Nazi hammer and the Soviet anvil, and you want to be independent. Maybe you don't like the idea of Russian domination, you don't like the idea of German domination maybe, and you want to be part of a US-led security architecture. And these contradictions have really sharpened in the years since the early 1990s. Back then in the early 1990s, yes, there were differences of opinion, but they didn't seem so stark. It wasn't clear that this was going to be the defining political argument about the future of this part of the world. Just as we have differences of opinion about all sorts of things in Western Europe. People have different attitudes to empire, for example, to the British Empire, just across the water in Ireland. But we rub along, we, at least until we started arguing about it in the context of Brexit, this seemed to be a dispute that could be left to the historians. But it's sharpened, and the more, and I feel we're in a kind of circle now, that the more it sharpens, the more both sides take means to assert their point of view, and the worse it becomes. Now, I don't know if anyone here remembers, and this is, for me, one of the most important political and geostrategic inflection points. Does anyone here remember the Zapad exercises of 2009? Now, this was, I think, the most important turning point. It was more important than the cyber attack on Estonia. It was more important than the war in Georgia. It was more important than the murder of Alexander Litvinenko. This was the moment when the West woke up and decided we have a serious problem with Vladimir Putin's Russia. And what's interesting about this is if you talk to not just Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians and Poles, but also to Swedes and Finns and Norwegians and Danes and others, this was the really important moment. This was an exercise, a big military exercise, unprecedented in its size, unprecedented in its secrecy, unprecedented in its scenario, which was the invasion and occupation of the Baltic states, and unprecedented in its military dimensions because it concluded with a dummy nuclear attack on Warsaw. Now, of course, none of this happened. It was all being played out in a big war game in Russia and Belarus. But that was the big wake-up call. And since then, in the 10 years since then, responding to Zapad, or technically Zapad and Ladoga, because it was technically two exercises, has been a major motor of the West's thinking about security in that part of Europe. But it's not just this argument about history and geography and the status of the Central and East European countries. There's another big argument as well, and that could be, I think, described as who runs the world and how. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was really no argument about that. There was only one country that was a real political, economic, and military success story, and that was the United States. And for any other country in the world, your relationship with the United States and your relationship with the security architecture and the security organizations led by the United States, that was what was really important. Didn't necessarily mean you had to join these organizations, but certainly they were the big games in town. And that's changed now. It's changed in several ways. First of all, that US-led international rules-based order is looking pretty shaky now. It looks, from one point of view, it looks hypocritical. This supposedly rules-led order doesn't always play by its own rules. Plenty of opportunities to criticize it. War in Yugoslavia, war in Iraq, war in Libya, many other things as well. But also the people who run this don't seem to believe in it very much, not least the President of the United States, who is skeptical of the whole idea of the United States being at the heart of global security architecture. But there's also increasing dissatisfaction in Russia. And if you talk to Russian officials, I do, they say these rules were established at a time when Russia was weak. They don't take account of Russia's interests. We don't like them. We don't take this as being as natural as the laws of gravity, as the laws of physics. We want to have a different way of running things, and we object to the way the OSCE is run. We object to the way the Council of Europe is run. We object to the EU telling us how we can sell our energy. We object to NATO as the European security guarantor and architect. We object to all this stuff. We just don't accept it. And so we're pushing back. And that is the second element of the new Cold War. So what are the tactical sides of this? What does Russia do? Well, it's a mixture of old tactics and new tactics. The old tactics are very familiar to anyone who studied the Soviet Union. We have desinformation. That was something that was developed way back. If you go back, anyone here know who Dmitry Manulsky was? One of the very few old Bolsheviks who didn't get bumped off by Stalin. Go back and read Dmitry Manulsky on propaganda. It's really interesting. A lot of what the Russian Federation's propagandists are doing now has direct echoes of Soviet propaganda from the 20s and 30s. I'm agnostic about propaganda. Lots of countries do it. I don't think that there's anything, many of these tactics are, if you like, actor agnostic. One just has to acknowledge that they're happening. But this is an old Soviet tactic, but with some new twists to it. The internet has allowed a level of anonymity, ubiquity, and immediacy, which the old Soviet propagandists couldn't have dreamed of. Assassination, again, not a very well-known Soviet tactic, but we see that being revived with the hitmen of the GRU and FSB, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully, trying to assassinate people in other countries. Physical intimidation, cyber intimidation, targeting individuals. And then there's the newer tactics. I mentioned the internet, but there's a whole range of things like the hacking and leaking tactic, which is immensely effective. You use fairly basic cyber means to break into someone else's server, someone else's emails, and then you release those emails into the public information space. And the result is a scandal. People say, oh my goodness, here are politicians committing politics in private. When you look at it with a neutral eye, you often feel this isn't actually so really shocking. One would expect that the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's aides would be getting together to try to stop Bernie Sanders getting the nomination. But when this is hacked with a pretty simple, primitive form of hacking, we're not talking very high-end stuff here, it's dumped on a website, dressed up to look like an American news organization. The so-called DC leaks, as it was called. And my beloved colleagues at the New York Times and Washington Post run off after this story saying, oh my goodness, what a scandal. How shameful this is happening. These politicians doing things in private behind our backs, without asking why has this information been leaked? Who's actually behind the leak? Or if they do mention this, this was in paragraph 15 of the story. Now, these tactics are not universally effective, and they're not always effective over time. So it's very interesting to me that this hacking and leaking attack was really effective in the United States. It didn't really work in France. Some of you may be familiar with Macron leaks, where you had another very similar operation. The GRU hackers went into the email servers and the document storage of the Macron campaign. They managed to steal a lot of stuff and they put it on the internet. But it didn't work so well in France because the French press, the French media, decided they weren't that interested. They saw this was an attack on the political system of the French Republic, and that was the main thing, and the fact that it might reveal something embarrassing about Mr. Macron was secondary. And in fact, it turned out that there was very little there that was embarrassing. There was some doctored, some invented documents that were put in there, which appeared to show he had an offshore bank account, but they were quickly identified as fakes. So I think this highlights quite an important point, that these tactics are quite often counterproductive. Counterproductive in the short term because people get scared and they say, hang on, why are we being attacked by the Kremlin? We need to do something. Counterproductive in the long term because people take countermeasures. I think one of the best examples of this counterproductive approach comes from Sweden and Finland. Now, you will know that Sweden and Finland are not members of NATO. Sweden and Finland, after 1991, downsized their military. They had strong independent militaries during the Cold War, but Sweden in particular really disarmed. They said, we don't need territorial defence anymore because Russia is a friendly country, nobody's going to attack us, and so Swedish armed forces will basically be there for expeditionary warfare, for going to international missions in other parts of the world. And there was an enormous, solid political consensus in the Swedish security culture about this, and it lasted all the way through the 1990s, it lasted all the way through the years from 2000 to 2010. And then it began to fray. It changed a bit after Zapad. It changed because they started seeing GRU officers on missions in Sweden in ways that couldn't be explained as anything other than unfriendly reconnaissance. And it started changing because they saw intrusions into their maritime waters with Russian submarines, and also into their airspace. And it really changed on Good Friday, the Friday before Easter 2013, when a Russian military flight on what seemed to be on a routine mission from Kaliningrad to St. Petersburg suddenly turned round, turned west, and made a dummy bombing run on two strategic Swedish installations, the air defence headquarters in southern Sweden and the electronic surveillance, electronic sort of intelligence and decryption building in Stockholm. And there was no explanation for that. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate attempt to intimidate. And what was very embarrassing for Sweden was they had disarmed so much that there was no Swedish Air Force on duty. There was not a single plane, not a single crew anywhere in Sweden. The Royal Swedish Air Force had gone away for the Easter weekend. The country was defenceless. So in a way, this was a very good stunt, and I'm sure that they were drinking vodka toasts in the Defence Ministry or in the Air staff or wherever this mission had been ordered, at the way in which they had humiliated the Swedes and shown them there's only one country in the Baltic Sea region which is a real krutty military power, and that's Russia. Get used to it. But of course, it was actually counterproductive. What's actually happened since then? Sweden is raising its defence spending. Public opinion in Sweden has swung very sharply. There is now, according to some opinion polls, a majority of Swedish opinion wants to join NATO. Sweden has established a very tight bilateral defence relationship with the United States. It's established tight bilateral relationships with Finland and with Denmark. So in fact, the result of this great military operation on Good Friday 2013 is exactly the opposite of what I would argue was in the long-term interests of the Russian Federation, which is to have friendly relations with its neighbours. These tactics are evolving. I think I mentioned earlier 2009, and I think that NATO has now, both in terms of NATO headquarters and NATO countries outside the region, but also the NATO countries in the region, we've basically solved that problem. If 2009 happened again, we wouldn't be scared. We have small, few hundred, but small deployments of British forces and French forces in Estonia, Canadians in Latvia, Germans in Lithuania, Americans in Poland. And the danger of a Crimea-style surprise attack on the Baltic states, I think, is close to zero now. This wouldn't happen. It wouldn't be possible to create the distractions and other tactics that were used by the Kremlin in the operations in Ukraine. And if there was any military intervention in the Baltics, it would immediately lead to casualties from a lot of NATO countries, some big, serious NATO countries. So I think that we've basically established a workable deterrent in the Baltic states and in Poland, and that problem is solved, and that's good. But what worries me about Western security thinking and the way we deal with this, with the new Cold War, is that it's a bit like driving a car where you're always looking through the rear view mirror and working out what it is that just happened to you. Was that a bump in the road? Was it a hole in the road? Was it a log on the road? What did I just do? Did I just take the wrong turning? We're getting, I wouldn't say better, but we're getting less bad at dealing with the problems of the past. But I think we're not good at dealing with the problems that are coming towards us. And this is what worries me most about Western security thinking. We are not good at dealing with the threat from artificial intelligence, and particularly what happens if you use artificial intelligence to attack another country's political system. We are not good at dealing with deep fakes. I don't know what the Russian is for deep fakes. It was a word that was invented in English after I stopped living in Russia. But deep fakes are like CGI in Hollywood movies. They are computer-generated images that look like real people. So I could have a deep fake where I would have Calypso talking in Calypso's voice, looking like Calypso, and telling you something that Calypso has never said. And I can do that simply by recording half an hour of her speaking, taking some video of the way she moves and the way her facial muscles move when she speaks, feed that into software, and I can make Calypso say anything. 5 years ago, that would have cost millions and taken weeks. Now it's almost free. You can get the software that does this on the internet. This is going to be a very profound challenge to the way in which we issue commands, to the way in which we relate to public figures. You could have a commander-in-chief issuing an order to surrender. This is, I think, the next generation of warfare, and we are not doing very well in dealing with it. I haven't mentioned dirty money, but I want to finish up by looking at that, because I think this has really been the West's biggest weakness. The central message of my book, The New Cold War, was if you think that only money matters, then you're defenseless when people attack you using money. It was the biggest mistake we made after 1991, was to think that money is neutral. In Latin, there's a marvelous little Latin phrase, pecunia non olet, money doesn't smell. Well, actually it does. And we've seen since 1991 that the Western financial system is wide open to the use of dirty money. You can steal money in one country, you can hide it in another. You can take money that is hidden in one country and you can use it to buy respectability and gain political power in a third country. And we really see that here. We see people who I think should not even be allowed to get visas to visit this country, being allowed to endow schools, and colleges and buildings and libraries in cities such as Oxford. This is money where if you ask hard questions about where the money comes from, it's really a pretty sad answer. This is money that was stolen from the people of Russia, from the people of Ukraine, from the people of other countries, by people who are basically gangsters. And the money has gone through the offshore financial system, come into this country via the City of London, and is used to buy respectability. In some cases, people even get knighthoods. And a particular twist to this is we have very tough libel laws in this country, which means it's very hard to talk about this publicly. When I was at The Economist, I spent a year of my life defending The Economist against a libel action brought by an extremely rich, and I found out also very dangerous, Russian, who was offended by something that we'd written, and it cost The Economist £500,000 just not to lose this libel case. And unfortunately, the terms of the settlement are I can't mention his name, we can't talk about it in public. Luckily, The Economist is a very rich publication, and we could afford £500,000 to fight for the truth and preserve our dignity. But for him, I don't know how much he spent, but I'm sure he didn't even notice. He's one of the richest men in Russia. I think this is one of the people talk about the front line of the new Cold War. And people used to say the front line was Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, these countries that are next former parts of the Soviet Empire and which are right up close against Mr. Putin's expansionist, neo-imperialist foreign policy. But I don't think that's true anymore. I've changed my mind on that. These countries are actually quite safe. They're safe because they are part of NATO, in the case of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. They're also safe because they have a strong security culture. They understand that there is such a thing as information warfare. They understand there is such a thing as subversion. They understand there is such a thing as dirty money. They understand most of the tactics that may be used against them, and they're quite good at dealing with them. I think the real front line is different. The real front line runs through Rome, where you have two parties which both think that the Putin regime is wonderful and want to get close to it. It runs through Germany, where Russia has made enormous investments in buying up parts of the German political elite. It runs through France, where every party except Mr. Macron's party in the recent elections was pro-Putin. It runs through Britain, where the City of London, which is the one thing that keeps our country's economy afloat, particularly in these difficult times which you were hearing about this morning of Brexit, the City of London, which is determined not to do anything that will keep out the tide of dirty money from rich Russian oligarchs and from other people who don't like to talk about the source of their money. And most of all, it runs through Washington, D.C., where we've seen this spectacularly successful political intervention in the American presidential election, leading to the biggest challenge to NATO's credibility that we've seen since the 1960s. So what do we do about this? Well, it's partly deterrence and it's partly resilience. I think the military deterrence is in good shape. I don't think we have any need to do any more, really, than we've done already. I want to see more financial deterrence. I think the lesson that the Putin regime would really understand would be, we've got your money, and if you want to see it again, back off. I've been advocating to the American administration, to the British government, to others, that we should be doing, we don't need more military exercises, we need financial exercises. We need to say, let's see what we can do in 24 hours to seize and freeze assets of Kremlin cronies, the people around Putin. What could we do? How long would it take? What happens if at the weekend you need to freeze money that is in an Austrian bank account? Who do you call in Austria? What legal basis do you need to do it? Let's practice this stuff. And then let's announce the results and say we did a financial snap exercise and we were able to freeze in the course, theoretically, we didn't actually freeze it, but we rehearsed the freezing of $50 billion or euros or pounds in assets belonging to Mr. Putin and his inner circle. I think that would be a really powerful deterrent. I'd much rather have that than have new nuclear submarines carrying the British nuclear deterrent. Because that kind of message gets across. I think fundamentally, at the absolute heart of the Putin system although there is imperialism there, I think the corruption is even bigger. And if you want to attack corrupt people, you attack them through their money. And this would also have a very beneficial effect on us. The more we clean up our financial system, the better it is for us. So I'm going to stop there. I look forward to questions. And I would say particularly, please ask critical, hostile questions, because they are much more interesting than friendly ones. But I'm always reminded, I'll finish on this one thing, that during the Cold War, when I was sitting in Oxford, I wasn't a student here, but doing stuff for dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, organising little fundraisers to try and support things in the really difficult times of the early 80s. The first Russian phrase I learned wasn't glasnost, wasn't perestroika, because those hadn't really been invented. And I've still got somewhere the notebook where I wrote it down in English, because I didn't even know the Russian letters then. But I thought it was the most marvellous phrase I'd ever seen. It was "Za vashu I nashu svobodu." And I got really interested in that, and I read the history of it, the 1860s, and how this was the great rallying cry that had brought Poles and Russians and others together against the autocracy of the Tsarist Empire. Many of you will know that it was also the slogan that was taken onto Red Square in 1968, in that amazing, tiny little demonstration, which launched the modern human rights movement against the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia. Za vashu I nashu svobodu. And I think we need to just update it a bit. It should be za vashu I nashu prozrachnost, za vashu I nashu chestnost, for all these qualities that the Putin regime, the weaknesses that the Putin regime finds in the West and uses, the disunity, the greed, the complacency, and so on, they are also things that the Putin regime uses inside Russia to establish its power. So it is a common battle. So that, I hope, gives you a rough outline of the new Cold War and also possibly an idea about how we might win it.